Well, we are already into Module 6 in this Bible Overview course, and we are going to tackle the 11th period of Bible history. We call it the time of Christ. You can call it the Gospel era. There are other names you can call it, but it's the time of Christ, the life of Christ. So, welcome and let's get started. All right, let's do some review before we begin the actual lesson. So far, we've covered the following periods of Bible history: the origins, the patriarchs, the Exodus, tribal Israel and Canaan, the united kingdom of Israel, the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah, then Judah alone, the time of the Judean exile, then the restoration, and then the intertestamental era. In this lesson, we'll look at the time of Christ, and then in the following lesson, we'll look at the apostolic years. All right, let's move on, and we'll do some more review. So here's a review of the empires that have played a role in our Bible survey class. The old Babylon Empire under Hammurabi and those people way back before and during the time of Abraham. Egypt also rose sometime before the time of Abraham and certainly was very much a power during his lifetime and afterwards. The Hittites were about the same time as the middle period of Egyptian history. Israel under David and Solomon would have been a major force in the Middle East, probably the undisputed leader in the nations of the Middle East at the time, followed by Assyria, which deported and scattered the northern kingdom of Israel. New Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, which then deported the Jews and exiled them to Babylon. Medo-Persia, which freed the Jews and sent some of them back. They are also the ones that fought the Greeks. And then the Greeks eventually prevailed under Alexander the Great, became an empire, and then finally Rome, which is the empire that we're going to look at in this period. Beginning in 606 BC, the Jews were taken captive to Babylon. We talked about that in the previous lesson. And this was because of their unfaithfulness to the covenant that they'd been warned over and over again about. That caused a situation in which a large number of Jews lived outside their land. We call that Judaism of the diaspora, which actually continues down to this very day. And of course, these Jews living in the diaspora became very familiar with Gentile culture. The results of that exile: the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians and the Levitical system was interrupted. There's no more sacrifices. The Levites don't seem to have a particular religious job to do at this point, as they don't today. Synagogues were established in place of temple worship. They are places of prayer and scriptural study and fellowship. And then the use of the Aramaic language became common rather than the use of Hebrew, which died out because they weren't in their native land anymore. And that required scriptural translation for the first time. Jews speaking Aramaic or Greek had to then learn Hebrew as a learned language in order to read their scriptures. And of course, Bible translation has been an important part of religious life among Jews and Christians ever since. A little bit more review before we begin the lesson. New sects began to appear among the Jews of the diaspora. By sects, I mean groupings among Jews with different emphases and different opinions about things. For example, the Pharisees, they came into being as a reaction to Israel's very lax and lazy attitude towards the Torah. They emphasized that we ought to observe the law strictly, and they created restrictions and interpretations which went far beyond God's requirements. They called it building a hedge around the law, meaning that we're going to build a barrier that's even stricter than what God required so that for sure we don't break God's laws. And the reason is because we're being punished because we broke the covenant, so we don't want that to happen again. The Sadducees were a priestly and aristocratic party which cooperated with the Gentile overlords of various kinds, Greeks, Romans, etc., to safeguard Jewish life. They were focused on temple rituals and practices and then their own kind of presiding over the religious life of Israel and Judah, of course, mostly Judah by this time. And then other sects included the Herodians, which were the supporters of the Herod family, Herod the Great and his descendants. The Zealots, which absolutely hated the Romans and wanted to drive them out. They were basically Jewish terrorists. And the Essenes, which thought all the other Jews were sellouts, and they retired into communities in order to practice what they consider to be pure Jewish faith. All right, the development of the synagogue during the exile and the translation of the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, both of these things had the effect of bringing Gentiles in close contact with God, the God of Israel, for the first time. So now you've got the Jews dispersed among the Gentiles. They were supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. They kind of kept to themselves, and now they're forced to be a light to the Gentiles. And so many Gentiles not only hear about the God of Israel, but are intrigued. Then the 400 silent years, which span the last of the writing prophets of the Old Testament, around 425 BC, until the birth of Christ, sometime around 4 BC, some maybe as late as 2 BC, were a time when God's final preparations were being made to send his Son into the world. Galatians 4:4. At the proper time, God sent his Son into the world. All right, we're done with the review. Now let's talk about some of the background for the Gospels. The Greeks have now been replaced by the Roman Empire. Sometime in the 100s BC, Rome more or less gobbled up the Greek Empire. They still kept a lot of the Greek cultural elements. They kept the language of government in the East, at least, but they replaced it with the Roman administrative structure. So in the 1st century BC, they added Judea as a province, specifically in 63 BC. The Romans tended to allow their subject peoples to keep their own ways, their own religious viewpoints, and so on, as long as they submitted to Rome's dominance and didn't rock the boat. The legacy of Roman rule, for better or for worse, of course there was a lot of worse with the Romans, was the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, Roman justice, Roman roads. Law, order, speedy travel were to have an enormous impact on the spread of the gospel after the resurrection of Jesus. So here you see a map of the Roman Empire at its height, which really after the time of Jesus, about maybe 50 years after the time of Jesus or so, the Romans finally conquered Britain, which was their furthest northwest province, but it included France and Spain. It included, of course, Italy, which is the homeland, but a lot of southeastern Europe. They included what would now be Turkey and the Holy Land, Egypt, and all of North Africa eventually came under Roman rule. So you can see that they were very dominant, very ambitious. In fact, the Mediterranean, which is in the middle of everything, was sometimes referred to as the Roman Lake. The New Testament contains 27 canonical books, meaning books that were officially accepted by the early church. It was written in Koine Greek, or Common Greek, and the books were written between the years 45 to 95 AD, maybe as late as 100 AD, but probably before that. So that's just the general information on the New Testament. The New Testament period can be subdivided into two time frames or two periods. The time of Christ, which would be the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the apostolic years, which is everything else. This session, of course, are going to focus on the time of Christ as recorded in the Gospel accounts. So an overview of the New Testament is that it begins with the birth and life of Jesus and his ministry among the Jews in Judea and Galilee. And the New Testament ends with the Gospel, which is the core Christian message, the good news about Jesus, spreading throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. The four Gospels record eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus, and they include these four books: Matthew, which portrays Jesus as the King of Israel, probably aimed at a Jewish audience; Mark, who is not a direct eyewitness, but probably is reflecting Peter's memoirs. He depicts Jesus as the man of action, most likely aimed at a Roman audience in general. Luke portrays Jesus as the perfect human. He also was not a direct eyewitness, but interviewed people who were eyewitnesses to the events. He's aiming at an educated Greek audience. And John portrays Jesus as the Son of God. Seems to be aiming at a general audience. And John fills in the missing gaps in the life of Christ that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not include. The four Gospels are subdivided into two groups. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they present Jesus' ministry in a similar format. So that's why when you're reading along in, say, Luke, and you've already been through Matthew and Mark, you go, I think I've read this before. But no, they're telling the same story, but from their own viewpoint. Now, John was written later, probably at least maybe 15 to 20 years after the other Gospels had been written, probably saw the gaps in Jesus' life and ministry that the other Gospels did not include, and so he included those events. John is 90% different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the Synoptic Gospels because they present Jesus' life and ministry in a similar way. So we believe that John was written to fill in the gaps that the Synoptic Gospels left. So between the four of them, we have a very complete picture of Jesus' life and ministry. The fact that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar has been considered to be a problem by some people. It's called the synoptic problem because they're the synoptic Gospels. So the problem goes something like this. Why do the synoptic Gospels include many of the same episodes from Jesus' life and yet have many unique features and emphases that go with each one of them? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The best answer is probably to explain that before the synoptic Gospels were put in written form, which would be 25 to 30 years after the life of Jesus, an oral template could have been developed for telling the story of Jesus. There was sort of a format that the early Christians used to tell Jesus' story. It could be that Matthew, Mark, and Luke may have simply made use of this standardized format to present the life of Jesus, and then filled in their own details to present their own accounts of Jesus' life. I think that's probably the best explanation for why those three are so similar and yet have their own unique differences. So let's look at a general timeline for the life of Christ. First is the birth and early life of Jesus that is recorded mostly in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. There are only two birth stories, one in Matthew, one in Luke, and then there's that episode of the early life of Jesus, that episode when he was 12 years old. Then there's the time of preparation, which would be his baptism and temptation in the wilderness. Then the public ministry of Jesus, which takes place over about 3 years. Then there's Passion Week at the end of the 3rd year, and the post-resurrection ministry and ascension of Jesus after his suffering and death, as well as resurrection. Here's a map of the Bible lands during the New Testament times. You don't see Bethlehem on the map, but the lower black arrow is pointing towards it. Jerusalem is the upper black arrow pointing towards Jerusalem. Nazareth would be the hometown to the north where Jesus grew up. Capernaum would be the town where Jesus had most of his ministry, and his ministry headquarters was in the north. And then, of course, Jerusalem would be the headquarters whenever Jesus was in the south, in Judea. So the north is Galilee, the south is Judea. You see the Sea of Galilee up towards the top of the map, the Dead Sea at the bottom of the map, where Jesus probably had a lot of his temptation experience, and the Jordan River connecting them. Let's dig a little deeper into the birth and early life of Jesus. As I said, Matthew and Luke are the only two Gospels that record Jesus' early life and his birth. Matthew records Jesus' legal genealogy through Joseph, and Luke seems to record Jesus' descent physically through Mary. Both parents were of the tribe of Judah and of the line of David, which would be a prerequisite for claiming to be the Messiah later on. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, where Micah 5:2 says that he would be born, where Messiah would be born. And of course, we think that he was born sometime between 2 and 5 BC, something like that. We know that he had to have been born before Herod died, and Herod died sometime between 1 and 3 or 4 BC. So sometime in that general area was when Jesus was born. The only incident from Jesus' youth that is recorded in the Gospels is of the time when Jesus was 12 years old and he stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents actually had lost track of him and forgot to take him with them when they went home. Mary and Joseph finally found him about his father's business in the temple, according to Luke chapter 2. And as far as we know, Jesus grew to maturity in the Galilean town of Nazareth. The time of preparation occurred in those first few months of his first year of ministry. He was baptized by John the Baptist, perhaps in the late 20s AD, maybe as late as 30 AD. Then he made his first contact with several men who would become his disciples. John the Apostle is one of them, and some others, Andrew, and eventually Peter. Directly after that event, he spent 40 days in the wilderness fasting and undergoing temptation. In Jesus' 3-year ministry, he taught using parables, which are stories that illustrate a spiritual truth. I think there are something like 32 or 33 parables that Jesus told in his ministry. The prodigal son, the pearl of great price, the man who bought the field, knowing that there was treasure buried there, many, many others. The theme of his teaching was always the coming kingdom of God, or sometimes in the book of Matthew, the kingdom of heaven, which can be explained because Matthew seems to be writing to Jews. Jews didn't like to say the term God, so sometimes they substituted the term heaven. Jesus worked miracles as signs of his identity as the Messiah and as signs of the validity or truth of his message. And this happened during all 3 of his years. The approximately 3 years of Jesus' public ministry can be divided as follows. First is the year of obscurity. He was not that well known in that first year. He was gathering disciples and establishing himself. The second year is the year of popularity, where he was known by many, many people. The crowds flocked to hear him teach and to see his miracles. And the third year would be the year of opposition, where the Jewish leadership was getting very, very suspicious of him and was plotting to kill him eventually towards the end. And that plot took form in Passion Week, which would be that last week of his third year, the year of opposition. In that first year, the year of obscurity, Jesus called officially his first disciples. He had called some of them earlier on, but he selected 12 eventually and officialized them as his followers, his students. Jesus then worked his first miracle at Cana in Galilee, where he turned water into wine at a wedding, which was an announcement that proclaimed himself to be Messiah. The first cleansing of the temple, we believe, he did it twice. First at the beginning of his ministry and second at the end of his ministry. And then that visit from Nicodemus during that year of obscurity where Jews were not quite sure who he was. Nicodemus and some others had come to the conclusion that he was the Messiah, but he was not yet accepted, and so Nicodemus came to visit him secretly at night. Next came the year of popularity. Jesus continued to work many, many miracles, in fact, probably more that year than the previous one. He taught the crowds, he healed the crowds, he began to criticize and interact with the Jewish leadership who were wondering who he was, who he thought he was, and then he made several trips between Galilee and Judea in the south. So Galilee's the north, Judea's the south. The year of opposition was the second year. And though Jesus continued to teach and work miracles, he is now forced to make several trips to escape the opposition of the Jewish leadership. When he gets in trouble in Judea, he escapes to Galilee. When he's in trouble in Galilee, he escapes north into Lebanon and into the areas of the Gadarenes. And then sometimes when he's in trouble in Judea, he escapes to Perea across the Jordan River. This is the time when Jesus is transfigured as the Messiah, when he's seen on the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and Elijah. And then Jesus journeys to the crisis in Jerusalem, which he knows awaits him. As Jesus' ministry progressed, he made claims to being the Messiah and the Son of God more and more. For example, John chapter 8 and the verses around verse 58. John records 7 I am statements by Jesus, which claim divinity by identifying him with the God of Israel. Remember, the God of Israel revealed himself to Moses in Exodus 3:14 as the I am. And so when Jesus claimed to be the I am, he's claiming to be God in a way that was unmistakable to Jewish people. Jesus also increasingly focused on the training of the 12 disciples, later designated as apostles. He knew that his time was short. He knew that he was going to leave the church leadership to them, and so the training was of all importance. Then came Passion Week. We believe there was a second cleansing of the temple during that time, and he continued to teach in the temple precincts during that entire week. Then there was the decision to kill Jesus by the leadership of the Jews, both Pharisees, Herodians, and Sadducees. Then there was the celebration of the Passover and the upper room discourse, mainly recorded in John chapters 13 through 17. Then the trials before the Sanhedrin, and then Herod, and then Pilate. Finally, the crucifixion on Friday morning, and then his death Friday afternoon, his time in the tomb on Friday, Saturday, and part of Sunday, and then his resurrection on Sunday morning. Let's talk a little bit more about that upper room discourse in John 13 through 17. In that time, Jesus gave his final teaching to the gathered disciples during the Passover meal. This is when he had to finalize and drive home the main things that he wanted them to know before he left them. He prepared them for leadership of a new body of people, called the church, and he initiated a new covenant using the elements of the bread and wine from the old covenant. Judas then departed the Passover early in order to betray Jesus when he went to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. Although Jesus suffered an unjust accusation, unfair trial, and execution at the hand of his enemies, the following books of the New Testament see those events not as a tragedy, but as a sacrifice for the sins of the world and a condemnation of the world system. Jesus is recorded as physically rising from the grave after portions of 3 days, Friday to Sunday, and that is illustrated as being victorious over sin and death and the beginning of a new covenant in which the gospel, or the good news about salvation and forgiveness, will spread to the ends of the earth before Jesus returns. Then there's the post-resurrection ministry and ascension of Jesus. Jesus appeared to his disciples periodically for several weeks after the resurrection. He appeared, of course, on that Sunday afternoon when the disciples were gathered, and then a couple of other times after that, as well as in Galilee when they all went back to Galilee and started fishing. His final charge to his disciples was to wait for the power of the Holy Spirit to carry the gospel to the ends of the earth. That's in Matthew 28, 18 through 20, and then again another version of it in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. So let's summarize. In their focus on Jesus of Nazareth, the Gospels proclaim the good news that the Messiah of Israel did appear among the Jewish people and was revealed as the Son of God through the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies and through his teaching and miracles. The crucifixion of Jesus is shown not as a tragedy, but as the final atonement for sin, and his resurrection as the ultimate victory over death. See you in Lesson 7.